I'll say good morning and pay tribute to you all, the brave, who anybody can get up early and get packed and get to a 10 o'clock meeting on the last day of a conference deserves a medal. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk to you today, ostensibly about the book, but what it's really about are the people that I met while I was writing the book, and it's changed the way I think about higher education, which I've been doing in a formal way for about 50 years. And so I want to focus in on the people who are going to be affected by this change, and then the entrepreneurs, higher ed and other, that are doing something about it. But first, my understanding of the current situation that we have is that the traditional university was like an oasis, an information-rich oasis, if you will, in an information-poor desert. And you had to go there to get something you couldn't get anyplace else. And today, my view of it, my understanding of it, is that the whole desert has gone green. And there really isn't anything you have to go anywhere to get. Now, there are exceptions to that. But what I'm trying to describe is a change that is so pervasive and so major, and not under the control of universities and colleges, that it is changing the environment within which they operate. And it's also, in a very different point, changing the environment within which people, learners, live. I'll remind you that of the adults who return to college today, and let's say 50 to 55% of the American population doesn't have a BA. It's a little more than that, I think. But 2/3 of them leave without a degree or a certificate for non-academic reasons. This isn't a matter of talent. It's a matter of us not knowing how to meet their needs. It's as if somebody went into an emergency room and the doctor said, "Come back when you can walk, and then we'll deal with you." And that's been our attitude. Imagine Nordstrom's talking about a buyer as somebody who persisted, right? But persistence, our language even talks about the struggle it's going to require for you to become educated. That's all about to change. And I think what I want to talk about really is that notion. Now, how many of you snowboard? Anybody? 1, 2. My kids all snowboard. This is a bizarre picture to me. I grew up using wooden skis. There were no other kinds. Dial telephones. You get the point. The fact of the matter is, the last 40 years and the last 10 years have just seen dramatic change. And we in higher education have been pretty good at resisting it. So what I want to do is talk to you first about the forces, then about the people. There's a trifecta at work here. Different people can have a different list. That's fine. There's no, I think, one right way. But colleges are increasingly, although still I think a very small minority, are becoming what I call adult-friendly. They're actually thinking about the patterns and the needs and the personalization that is required to deal with people over the age of 25. I believe, and we see it in this meeting all over the place, we're seeing the emergence of a GPS, what I call a GPS for learning and work. We can find the way to grandma's house. Some of you heard me say this earlier. Get in the front seat of our car, punch it in, and bang, you get the fastest route and you get the scenic route. And if there's construction along the way, you get an alternative route. Well, we're talking about something that's a little more complicated than that. But the fact is we're on the verge of being able to do that kind of mapping so that individuals can map their own journey with or without the help or advice of third parties. Perhaps the most important piece of the trifecta, and I admit that this is a bias of mine and has been for years, but we are able now, we have the capacity to validate learning wherever and whenever it happens. It's the end of what I call knowledge discrimination. We live in a world today where you learned something, where you learned it is more important than how well you know it. When in fact we know, and I'll show you some of the research results, that most of the learning we do goes on outside of college, the vast majority of it. Now, I'm not suggesting that brain surgeons should self-educate themselves. We can go to ridiculous extremes, of course. But the fact of the matter is there's a richness here. And it gets at, I think, one of the largest unstated social and economic issues in our country. There's a mythology in America, and now I want to talk about the learners and their perspective. There's a mythology in America. There's a limitless table of opportunity. You know, the school of hard knocks, live and learn, Horatio Alger. You know, if you work hard and you play by the rules, you're going to do just fine. You don't have to knock somebody down or wait for someone to die to get to that table. That's the fantasy. The reality is, because of knowledge discrimination, that for all sorts of people, it's a dead end. And not for me, probably not for many of you, but the fact is, the people I spoke with as I was doing this book weren't without a college degree because they didn't want one. They didn't know how to get there, or in other cases, they couldn't get there because of life, because of money, because of race, because of gender. And then they're trapped. And so, to me, the reality of this dead end is the consequence of what I labeled earlier, knowledge discrimination. That where you learn something is more important than how well you know it. And we are entering a time, I'm not worried about the 40% of the people who are succeeding right now. I'm thinking about the other 55 or 60%. The community college population was there 50 years ago. We just hadn't addressed it. And I say we're on the verge of another breakthrough where we can begin to look at all the other people in this country who are capable of doing this, but are kept from doing it by life circumstances. And so that's, by the way, a sunrise, not a sunset. And so what I'm thinking about is just this enormous opportunity where we have millions of people who, through no fault of their own, and I reached a new definition of privilege, I will tell you, as it relates to me anyway, which is privilege is never losing a fight that you didn't choose. Now, I've lost some fights in my life, but I picked every one of them. The alternative, people every day losing fights they never asked for. And to me, if I get passionate about it, that's what I care about. That's who I care about. Everybody should have a shot. So the notion that what we can do, and it's as plain to me as the nose on my face, but there's this sea of learning out there that is untapped, unrecognized, unvalidated. Not all of it's appropriate for whatever the goal may be, but a lot of it is. And what we have now in this, the free-range learning world that is coming, is the ability to sift through that learning with the learner and figure out what matters and what doesn't, and to end what I call knowledge discrimination. Alan Tuff, it's just passed on, Canadian researcher, wrote a book in the mid-'60s called The Adults Learning Projects. And what he found, and then it was subsequently validated by dozens of other research projects, the thing about adult learning projects which were outside of school, informal, from the point of view of higher ed, the average adult spends more than 800 hours a year in purposeful, important to them, learning projects, whether somebody else is providing the information or they're doing it themselves. That's about 15 hours a week. That's the average. Some people do far less, others do far more. What's really important to me, beyond understanding what that means times 40 million people or whatever it might be, is that they forget the lessons they learn. In other words, they take it in, they absorb it, it changes them, but they don't recognize it, and they, in many cases, don't recognize the change. And so what you have is the folklore of the society honoring that, live and learn, but the reality of the society is it is ignored and you are encouraged to ignore it yourself. And what I'm now seeing in this amazing development of technologically enhanced data analytics, et cetera, is the opportunity for us to take all that learning, make sense out of it for people on an individual and personalized basis. It will help employers, it will explain behavior, it will define pathways forward, and it is what we have been ignoring because the way we structured the system, we weren't worried about the 55% of the people who do it. So what I learned in the interviews is that again and again in people's lives, and if you think about your own, if you want to have some fun with this, when you have a minute, take all the coins out of your pocket and write down the date, the year on the coins, and then go back and try to think about what you did, what was important in this year or this year and this year. And you'll begin to understand in a very simple way what I'm describing. But again and again and again, and I describe some personal turning points as well as through the interviews, you come to a place in your life where you've got to change. You get divorced, you lose a job, you become a parent. It can be positive, it can be negative. But you realize that you got to change. Something's got to give. And if you can't handle that turning point and turn it into a successful transition, you become a prisoner of your circumstances or a prisoner of your experience, which is a terrible place to be. That's what we are encouraging by the absence of our ability to help people make sense again and again and again throughout their lives, who they are, make sense out of who they're becoming, what they know, what their strengths are, and how education can help them get to a better place socially, civically, economically, you name it. And so what it really becomes, when I talk to people who had been through what I think of as an assessment process that is, what's the best word? It's really, well, I was saying this yesterday, actually at one point, it's pedagogy. In other words, we're not just judging what you know, we're helping you understand how well you know it. We're helping you understand what it has meant to you, how you have changed, what you can do that you couldn't do before. These are all critically important things for people to understand. What happens, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Gail Sheehy's midlife crisis book. It was about 35 years ago. She was describing midlife crisis as a crisis, because people have grown into a person they don't know. There's that guy I'm looking at in the morning when I'm shaving, and all of a sudden I say, that's an old photo. I've become a different person. And that becomes in turn a crisis. Who have I become? Why have I become it? How am I learning? How have I been changed by the learning I've done? And I think when you wrap it all up, there are millions. We talk about the problem here, I think, from the perspective of our own, frankly, power and authority. We objectify it. It is deeply personal and deeply human for millions of people. And they are people who, through no fault of their own, are left by the wayside in far, far too many cases. So what I want to do now is talk about the trifecta from the point of view, not of the learners, but of the people that are doing it. I've gone through the issue of validation of learning, and we can talk about that. I'm going to leave some time for questions. But there are another 30 colleges, 40, maybe 50, I'll give you 100 even. But there are 6,000 in America. And the number of places that put the learner in the center, the adult learner in the center, and organize around them, these are 5 I picked. And I spoke with the presidents. You know, every college is different. It has different politics, different alumni, different, you name it. What was really interesting was the consistency in which they affirmed there isn't going to be one model in the future. There's going to be a whole lot of different models. But the kind of characteristics that would run through all those models, the consistency of service, what was going to be needed, was really remarkable to me. It was one assessment, that we have to really understand and make assessment a core part of what we do and of the learner's understanding. The second is personalization. I talked about persistence. You don't persist at Amazon. They say, hey, people who bought that want you to buy this. Now, we want to be a little more thoughtful than that, perhaps. But what they're doing is creating a user experience which respects you and what you've done and tries to help you think about where you want to go. All of the presidents of these institutions, and I haven't talked to a president who didn't, or deans, or vice presidents, or faculty, think that these characteristics are important. Third is learning support and advice. The idea that I'm with you all the way. Not, oh, you need help from the registrar, here's the number. What these folks are talking about is, you need help from the registrar, I'll help you. I'll go with you. So tremendous, and whether it's academic advice or administrative advice. Remember, 2/3 of the people who leave college over the age of 28 do so for non-academic reasons. Sometimes it's a push, unfriendly. Sometimes it's a pull. Life intervenes. Either way, we want to bring them back or keep them in with great learning support. They also all said align heavily with work. In other words, if in fact we're going to learn critical thinking, and we know that critical thinking or writing or problem solving is one of the skills that a particular occupation needs, how do we help a person develop not only the content they need, but the ability to apply that content in ways that are effective? Doing that explicitly, and I would argue, for the sake of it, and we won't do it today, you can do that with Shakespeare, you can do it with Emily Dickinson, you can do it with accounting. The idea that there is some kind of difference, I don't buy. We treat it as different, but it isn't. And then costs. They all said it's got to get more affordable. So, despite all the differences, even among these 5 institutions, all these presidents agreed on those 5 characteristics, and as they described where they want to go. And then the GPS for learning and work, again, there are all sorts of examples, okay? These aren't the only ones. These are ones I knew about, people I talked to, people who were willing to talk to me, et cetera. But what they're all doing is slightly different versions of helping people get what they want when they need it in a way that is responsive and useful to them. Officially, they don't care about colleges. Unofficially, they do. I would argue that I think colleges are going to continue to be very, very important. And the colleges that decide to partner up with folks like this to recognize their learning and to develop portfolios, et cetera, are going to be not only adult-friendly, but they're going to be the institution of the future with the characteristics that I was just describing. But they all agree, again, as different as their businesses are, the importance of technological enhancements. Can't get there. We wouldn't even be having this conversation if it wasn't for technology and technological enhancements, data analytics, the assessments that are possible now that were never possible before, work focus. Does this sound familiar? They're talking the same language as the adult-friendly college presidents. I think they are underneath that, in my view of it, informing and supporting an adult-friendly college. And lifelong learning portfolios, in other words, an ongoing living record. None of that's news to any of us. Doing something about it would be big news. Really doing something about it would be big news. So I think we're moving towards, based on the information that I got from the people, about 60 people I spoke with, and I have to admit, I feel a little guilty about this, but it had been a long time since I'd really sat down with an adult learner, worker, and said, so what's up? And the stories were really powerful and painful and compelling. And when somebody shows up to help them on their own terms, you cannot imagine the energy that is released, the positive energy and the intelligence. We are too used to saying if somebody can't get to college or doesn't finish college, that it's their fault, and that they're probably the inference or the interpretation is they're stupid. Real life facts say something very different indeed. We're missing out on all this potential. So at the end of the day, and I want to finish with just a couple of conclusions and then ask you to challenge me or ask me for more elucidation on any of these points. Two or three really important things. This new ecosystem is driven by technology and technology-enhanced capacity. If that's all there is to it, we fail. Because used correctly, technology should free people up to do what only people can do. And it's a new world, and it'll be a different world, slightly or dramatically, depending on where you sit and what you do. But this doesn't mean that people don't matter. And in fact, if we let it mean that, we've made an enormous mistake. But one of the people who reviewed my book said, you're going to break the parchment ceiling, which I thought was an interesting way of saying the gatekeeping function is going to change. In some cases, it will go away, of colleges. In other cases, it will not go away, but there will be a partnership, and the degree won't be the price of admission. That's the only way you can get where you need to go, unless that's the legal or the professional requirement. But there's going to be an era, I think, of partnership. Most importantly, and I've been at this for almost 50 years, God forbid, there's never been a change to higher ed, or that came, that the institutions and faculty governance did not control. And so they, in some cases, could co-opt the language, change a little, ignore it, whatever. The drivers of this new ecosystem lie beyond the control of institutions for the first time since the printing press, which had, if you go back and think about it, a dramatic effect on the way knowledge was translated or transferred. So colleges and universities do not control the sources, the forces that are driving the development of this new ecosystem, which means they ignore it at their own peril, and other institutions will come along, organizations will come along and fill a space that I believe could and should be filled by new forms of higher education, personal learning, lifelong learning. And as the presidents and as the entrepreneurs that I spoke with emphasized, there are going to be a million ways that this cat gets skinned. Lots of models, but there are going to be the characteristics which bind those models together. And that, to me, is where we need to focus. So what are the 4, 5, 6, 10 things that are the hallmarks of a quality institution or organization that is supporting the learning in a free-range learning world? Because the free-range learning world, it implies, you could infer, anybody can do anything. Well, that doesn't work that way, and learners don't learn that way, and 95% of people need different kind of support. What I would argue is as people approach the problem, the transition in their lives, whether they're 18 or 28 or 58, all of the opportunities that we have are all around them, but they're disorganized or they're arbitrary. And so as a Vermonter, or a recovering Vermonter, I say, it's a little bit like skiing in a blizzard with no goggles. And you're trying to sort out the best path. And to me, it isn't that anybody can do anything. That might be the philosophical implication. It's that we have an obligation, a responsibility, a social as well as an educational responsibility, to give them the goggles they need to live the lives that they want to live. That's the opportunity before us with majorly unserved populations. And to me, what's enormously exciting about it is that we get to go back as we try to create coherence out of this chaos, that we remember what we know about learning and learners and curriculum and content, and do it right, do it better. Do it better is not a fair word. Do it more appropriately for the people we're dealing with who have not been dealt with successfully before. Anyway, I talked longer than I was going to, and we got 10 minutes if you have one question, or we can talk outside. Again, thank you for coming, and congratulations on being able to get up so early on the third day of a meeting. Appreciate it.